I don't always take a text for these, but there is a verse that I do want to quote. Well, read from Matthew 5:15. It's so vital to this study tonight. The words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. We don't know exactly when the Sermon on the Mount was taught, but presumably early on in his ministry. And when he said, "Do not think that I am come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And that's a verse that we will look at very carefully. This is a subject that I prepared, I think, 20 years ago at Westminster Chapel. And at that time, it was just before Good Friday and Easter. Here we are after Easter, but it's soon enough, and a word always relevant. And I have to say, it's a personal thing a little bit. You'll forgive me for this, that a number of years ago, when I was at Westminster Chapel, I was accused of being an antinomian. And the word antinomian or antinomianism means against law. I had written a book called Once Saved, Always Saved. And it was amazing how everybody liked it. And even the Evangelical Times gave it a great review. About a year or so after that, I invited Arthur Blessed to preach at Westminster Chapel, and he shook us up. And there were those upset because of changes. And they thought, how are we going to get rid of the pastor? And they found a way. They decided that they didn't like the book Once Saved, Always Saved. After all, not everybody. But what they decided to do is to accuse me of being antinomian. It was a charge that didn't stick. It was false. But I thought I'd let you know that this is a subject very important in the light of what we went through, some hard times at Westminster Chapel. This term antinomian was a term Martin Luther actually coined. And as a result of his closest follower, funnily enough, his name was Johann Agricola. He was a Luther follower. And Agricola claimed that the law of God had no relevance in the life of the believer. Now, some believe that Agricola was the best exponent of Luther's teaching. And I'll tell you who thinks that. It's a man that many of you know, Dr. Michael Eaton. Dr. Michael Eaton said, if you really want to understand Luther, read Agricola. It was plain, simple, right to the point, and it was what Luther actually taught. But what had happened was that there was such a fear of people taking advantage of his teaching, saying, well, we're not under the law because the law has been fulfilled. We're not under the law, we're under grace. And there was a fear that people would abuse it. And Luther himself got cold feet. And but Agricola still taught what Luther originally taught. That is the claim, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. So you need to know, even Martin Luther had a fear that this teaching could be abused. And let's face it, it can be abused. It has been abused. It doesn't need to be abused. But Agricola went a little further than he needed to say that there was no relevance of the law of God in the believer. That's not quite true. There is relevance. And then others believe that Martin Luther went too far and is seen as the father of antinomianism, which is a term that Luther coined. And so he had coined the term and then disavowed Agricola's teaching. Well, it's an interesting footnote in history that I thought you might like to know about. So, there's two kinds of antinomianism. One is theoretical antinomianism, and you could say that's the New Testament position. But then there's practical antinomianism, where people take advantage of that and draw a conclusion. Doesn't matter how you live, you're still justified. And this is very sad. God puts us on our honor. He gives us the gift of eternal salvation. You are not obliged to keep the law, to stay saved. That isn't the way you got saved. You don't have to do anything to keep it. But God puts you on your honor. And that's why the New Testament has the teaching of reward or inheritance. So antinomianism became synonymous with the teaching that if we are saved, the law has no relevance for Christian living. Therefore, it does not matter how we live. And so my book, Once Saved, Always Saved, led some to charge me with being antinomian. Unfair charge, although I do believe we are eternally saved apart from works. Now, some of you have heard me say this. I did my thesis at Oxford on the doctrine of the Puritans and their view of saving faith. And nearly all of the Puritans, only one or two exceptions, believed that our assurance of salvation is grounded in the works of the law. It's a very sad departure. Luther did not teach that. Calvin did not teach that. But the Puritans were so afraid of the charge of antinomianism, and they were so afraid of teaching anything that would give a loophole. And they overreacted. There was embedded into the theological soil of English Puritanism a fear of antinomianism. You had it in William Cranmer. He vacillated on the teaching of justification by faith. He was so afraid of it. And I can tell you, I will not mention his name, but a very, very well-known New Testament scholar today, who I was at Oxford with. And he and I have been friends. I don't know him well now. We've drifted apart. But he wanted to meet Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, and I introduced them. And because this man has come up with, he calls, a new perspective on Paul. And it is so bad. It's horrible. It denies Luther, denies all that the Reformed theologies always taught. And I was there in the embryonic phase of his coming into this. And I happen to know it was this fear of antinomianism. Well, you can, I suppose, a healthy fear of antinomianism is not so bad, but it's very sad if you're driven by it and afraid to preach the truth. Whereas the Puritans did not believe in salvation by works, they did believe we are assured of our salvation by works. Get the difference. One thing to say we are saved by faith alone, but then they raise the question, how do we know we have faith that saves? Oh, well, this is important. The way to know that you've got faith that's saved is that you do this, you do this, you do this, and before you know it, all that the reformers did in setting the world free through the teaching of justification by faith was now under a cloud in the 17th century. They weren't discussing justification. They were talking about how to know you're justified. And we're right almost back to where we were. Not quite, but almost. Saying that you cannot know you're saved unless you're keeping the works of the law. They would even enforce the Sabbath, although it was Sunday, not Saturday, but you keep the law. You love God's ministers. You're faithful in church attendance and all the works of the law. You go beyond them if possible. And you have a sad situation with the English Puritans. None of them, and when I say none, I think it is true, had assurance of salvation. William Perkins, the very person that I studied most, and I have read William Perkins and had him running out of my ears after several months there, and I know his thinking backwards and forwards. In fact, Steve Sanders had just showed me something I'd forgot all about. And this is not why I'm saying this. I just happened to remember. You showed me that at the Puritan conference, Westminster Conference, back in 1974, I gave a 1-hour lecture on William Perkins. And the sad thing about Perkins, he did not know if he was saved or not. Now, isn't that something? Preach all your life. You not know whether you're saved. His followers didn't know whether they were saved. Perkins went to his death doubting whether he was a Christian. Imagine that. Well, Luther didn't have that problem. He set us free by faith alone. But when you bring in the question, but how do you know you have faith? And you're back to introspection, and it's very, very sad. Well, Puritans believe you are assured by works. I disagree. Our assurance of salvation is not to be based on works, but only as a secondary basis. It's a subsidiary ground of assurance. Primarily, how do you know you're saved? You're looking to Christ, plus no one, plus nothing. And you just stay there. Christ is the mirror of our election, as Calvin taught it. So the primary basis of our assurance is Christ alone. I refuse to check my spiritual pulse ever to decide, am I in or am I out? It's no way to live. Now, in this lesson, we will look at the law of God and how Jesus fulfilled the law. The law of God was given at Mount Sinai in probably around 1300 BC. This is one of those times I've had a big blackboard. I almost thought of having a big chart ready, but if you can picture something here, try to imagine first a straight line. I'm doing it, if I were looking at it, I'd be doing it this way, but because I'm looking at you, here's creation, and at the other end is Jesus dying on the cross. Okay, creation. And then you come to 1700 BC. That's the time of Abraham. Then you come to 1300 BC. That's when the law was given. Now, put in a parenthesis, brackets, the time of the law for the next 1300 years to when Jesus died on the cross. The point I want to make is that the law, which came 400 years after Abraham, was a long parenthesis, brackets, 1,300 years. That's how long we had the period of the law. Now, I'll be coming back to that in a second, but if you keep that in your mind, the law, we're told, was put into effect through angels by a mediator. That probably means that angels were the instruments of the finger of God. It's not that Moses himself chiseled it out. The angels with fire burnt into stone. It was supernaturally given. And so the original 10 Commandments, God did it, but according to Paul, angels literally did the work. The mediator in this case, however, was Moses. The law is generally thought to be in 3 parts. The moral law, that's the 10 Commandments. The civil law, how the people of God would govern themselves. And the ceremonial law, how the people of God should worship. Now, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus made this statement: "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law. I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." But then he also said, the law or the prophets. We must not forget that part, the prophets. Now, why would Jesus say, do not think that I've come to abolish the law? It's because there were people who thought that. There were people who thought that when Jesus, who they believed might well be the Messiah, the long-awaited Messiah, and Jesus knew he was that, his disciples thought he was that, people began to think maybe he's the one, and so they're going to ask themselves, well, if he is the one, wonder what he's going to do with the law. And so the first thing he says, as soon as he finishes the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount and says what he does about being the salt of the earth and the light of the world, he brings in the law. And he does it by saying, do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Jesus knew that some might think that he had indeed come to do away with the law. The word abolish or nullify comes from the Greek word katalusai, and this would have rendered the law useless and irrelevant had he done that. Well, some hoped he would do that. They would have loved it if he just came and said, it's over. It's like the President of the United States signing an executive order, and this is it. Well, Jesus could have done that, but he said, don't think it. No, don't even think it. Well, some, no doubt, hoped Jesus would nullify the law. There were the revolutionary type people who thought Messiah would do away with the law and start all over. You know, there are some people who love overturning any tradition, and they're ready just to fight. And there were those who thought he might destroy the law. There were those who hoped he would. Some prayed that he wouldn't. And if there were those present who hoped that Jesus would nullify the law, then their hopes are dashed, because he said, that's not what I'm going to do. And as I said, he had the authority to do this sort of thing had he wanted to. That's the kind of authority that he had. But no, he said, I've not come to abolish the law. Put it out of your minds. I'm not going to do that. And then he added, I have come to fulfill the law. Well, no one had ever made a claim like that. And then keep in mind, he added the prophets. He says, I'm going to fulfill the law. And he's implicitly saying, I'm also going to fulfill the prophets, what they said would come. So Jesus then sent a signal to all who feared he would abolish the law, and to all who hoped he would abolish the law. And whatever rumor there was, he put all those rumors to rest. So, far from there being any discord between his teaching and the law, there would be continuity between his teaching and the law. So that sent an ominous signal to anybody who did not want the law abolished. Then whatever did he mean when he said, I've come to fulfill it? Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones reckons that this was the most stupendous claim Jesus ever made. Do you realize what he's saying? Forget the part about the part, I'm not going to abolish the law. He said, I'm going to fulfill it. I'm going to fulfill it. And if people had any theological or historical awareness, they would say, wait a minute, what? You're going to fulfill it? It's an amazing claim. That meant that, first of all, he would do what had never, ever been done before. He's going to keep the law. No one had ever done that. he's going to fulfill it. That means that everything that the law called for, even in the sacrificial system, the ceremonial law, he says, I'm going to fulfill that. And amazing statement. Let that Matthew 5:17 verse sink in on you. Well, now, the purpose of this lesson tonight is to examine that claim that Jesus made. He said, I will fulfill the law. Do you know what he's saying? He says, I'm going to do it. First of all, I'm going to keep it by my life. I'm not going to break any of the 10 commandments. I'm going to ensure that the ceremonial law is kept, the civil law is kept. The ceremonial law is how God wanted to be worshiped. The civil law was how the people of Israel should govern themselves. And the 10 commandments, the moral law. But Jesus said, I'm going to do the whole lot. I'm going to do it. So, why is this lesson important? It is fundamental to the whole teaching of Scripture. Law and gospel is a way of summarizing the entire Bible. In fact, it's almost put like that in John 1:17. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, what's the purpose of this lesson? It's also to examine two great events. The first was what took place at Sinai in 1300 BC. Remember, going backwards, 1700 BC, time of Abraham. 400 years later, the law. All right. Then the purpose of this lesson is to understand the meaning and purpose of those two events, the giving of the law and the coming of Jesus Christ, how he fulfilled them, why the law came and what it meant for Jesus to fulfill the law. And yet, here's another pretty good reason to understand this teaching tonight. It will make you a good theologian. Does anybody here have a desire to be a theologian? Can I see your hand? Good land. What are you here for then? Why have you come? Did you think we were going to have a party? Do you think we're going to have champagne, caviar? I think that's what they want. Bruce, go, get it. They're not here. They don't want to study theology. They're here for... Wouldn't you like to be a pretty good theologian? You know, I want to be. I want to understand all I can. I have a thirst for knowledge that is equal to, if not greater, than 40 years ago, 50 years ago. I am still learning. I want to learn all I can. And I want to be a good theologian. But here's something kind of funny. 3 comments by Martin Luther. You ready for this? Number 1, Martin Luther said, whoever knows how to skillfully, whoever translated that split an infinity, because this would have come from the German language. So let me give it to you the right way. Whoever knows how skillfully to distinguish between the law and the gospel, by the grace of God, he also now knows how to be a theologian. So Luther's saying, if you know how to distinguish skillfully between the law and the gospel, then you're on your way to be a good theologian. Then he made another statement. Anybody who wishes to be a theologian must distinguish between the law and the gospel. But he wasn't finished. At another time he said, there's no man living on earth who knows how to distinguish between the law and the gospel. Well, I'm glad he said that, because it lets you know if you're a little confused and you're trying to work through, Luther first says you need to know the difference. Then he says nobody ever has. But I'm not sure that third statement is true. I think we can get pretty much to the bottom of it. But it does show we've got to do a lot of thinking. Now, what I wrote with my hands, creation, come to 1700 BC, time of Abraham. And God speaks to Abraham. And we're told, as we'll see in a few moments, that Abraham was given the gospel in advance. Very important for you to remember this. How important? Do you know, if all you did was to read Abraham, the story, from around Genesis 12 to Genesis 22, you master those 10 chapters and understand everything that is, you've got just about all you need to know how to live the Christian life. It's all you need. Just look at the life of Abraham. It's all there. So he comes along 1700 BC. And then 400 years later, the law. And as I said, from the time of 1300 BC to the time Jesus died on the cross, see it as one big parenthesis, brackets in history. What that means is, if I can get this over, I'll be so glad if I do. Once Jesus died on the cross, that parenthesis is gone, and you're back to Abraham. Because it's Abraham that gave us the gospel, and that's the big point Paul is going to make. When Jesus came, it was all about Abraham. When he died on the cross and said, it's finished, he's saying, law, no more, insofar as it having any hold on you. Doesn't mean it's irrelevant, but it does mean we're not bound to keep it. So, when Jesus said that he would fulfill the law, it meant, first, the end of an era, namely that of the law's rule. So, as you know, a sentence with a parenthesis or brackets can be read without quoting the entire contents of the bracket. I'm trying to think how to say it. If I were to say, where were you born, Bruce? Where? Gateshead. You know, that's your problem, isn't it? Okay. If I were to say, Bruce is the associate minister of Kensington Temple. That's a complete sentence, isn't it? But if I said, Bruce, born in Gateshead, brackets, you didn't need to know the brackets. Because the main thing, he's the associate pastor of Kensington Temple. That just gives you a little information, but you don't need it. Is that clear? Okay. All right. Brackets just make the meaning of the sentence a little bit clearer. You know more about Bruce, but you didn't need to know that. So, in fact, I wish I didn't know that. Abraham, Jesus, in the between, from 1300 BC, the law, but it's gone. You don't need it anymore. It's dealt with. All right. So, when Jesus said he would fulfill the law, it meant the beginning of an era, namely, all that was entailed in the meaning of the law being fulfilled. The Greek word plerosai means to fulfill, the opposite of destroy. It does not mean to supplement or enlarge. It does not mean to keep going or continue. It does not mean to obey. This means to bring about the event to which the law was pointing when he said, I've come to fulfill it. So the law pointed beyond itself. The law had never been fulfilled. See, all the sacrificial system, what's the point? Year after year, day after day. It was yearning for some kind of fulfillment. And so the law pointed beyond itself. And keep in mind, by law, it's not just 10 Commandments. We're talking about ceremonial law, sacrificial system. The law had not been fulfilled. And so no one had ever really kept the law. Even when the disciples were debating whether to let Gentiles in without being circumcised, the question was put, now then, why do you try to test God by putting on the necks of the disciples a yoke that neither we nor our fathers have been able to bear? Nobody ever kept it. Nobody ever kept it. You're going to say, well, why on earth did it come along? If nobody kept it, what's the point? Well, we're going to show you in a minute. But the very content of the law showed it was incomplete. And so, when Jesus said he would fulfill the law, it meant the fulfillment of the law and pointed to the same person and event were the object towards which it pointed. For example, Matthew 5:17, Jesus said, I have come to destroy, not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. He says, I am that person. I am that person. My coming is that event. It was a bold statement. It was also, therefore, a prophetic statement. It had not been done yet. He had another 2 or 3 years to live and to do it. But it was a promise that he would do what no other person had done. All right. You will want to know, I'm hoping if I did my job well, you're asking, well, why the law? What's the purpose? And that is what Paul asked. So that if you're reading Galatians, chapters 1, 2, 2.5, coming into 3, you're going to say, oh, why the law? What's the purpose of it all? So he's hoping that you're asking that, so he asks it for you. Galatians 3:19, why then the law? What then was the purpose of the law? And the answer is, it was added. He could have said it was a parenthesis. It was brackets. But why was it added? Because of the transgressions of the people until the seed, capital S, to whom the promise referred had come. And that's when he says the law was put into effect through angels by a mediator. So why does Paul say added? Well, now there are two verses. One, Romans 5:20, the other, Galatians 3:19. They both say the same thing. And what is interesting is that when Paul wrote Galatians, this would have been in the mid-50s, we think, 55 AD, somewhere like that. When he wrote Romans, possibly 62 AD. So there's almost certainly 5 years or more between writing Galatians when he was younger and Romans when he was not only older, but a number of Bible scholars, particularly Professor Gordon Fee, he's one of the great New Testament scholars of the century, he put a pretty good case that you can tell which letters Paul wrote early and which he wrote later, because there's a maturity in Paul in the later letters. Not a change of theology, but a maturity. For example, before, let's say it was 55 AD. We don't know the exact year. But let's say before 55 AD, he wrote 1 and 2 Thessalonians. He wrote 1 Corinthians. He wrote 1 Timothy. And he wrote Galatians. That's the earlier Paul. After 55 AD, closer to 60, he wrote Ephesians, Colossians, Romans, 2 Timothy. Now, Gordon Fee says that something happened to Paul, and he describes it in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, the greatest trial of his life, that so matured him and made him stronger that you can read the letters, Colossians, Ephesians, Romans. There's a depth that you don't have in the early ones. Now, my point in mentioning that is this. Both in Galatians when he was younger and Romans when he's older, he used the same word. The law was added. What's the point of it being added? Well, first of all, the fact that he says it in Galatians 3:19 shows that it was not an unguarded comment, because he says the same thing in Romans 5:20. The reason that this is important is that the law was never meant to replace the gospel. Why was the law added? The law was added because the gospel was already given to Abraham, 1700 BC. So the gospel was first preached to Abraham some 400 years before, as I say, 1700 BC. Here's where he says it, in Galatians 3. Understand then that those who believe are children of Abraham. The scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles by faith and announced the gospel in advance to Abraham. All nations will be blessed through you. So those who have faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. So here's the big deal. The gospel did not begin with Moses. It began with Abraham. That's why Jesus could say, your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. And so the law was added. That means it came alongside. The Greek word could equally read, it came alongside. It was extra. It paralleled the gospel that had emerged 400 years before. So when the law came in, it was never meant to be permanent. See, this is the thing that the Jews missed. To them, the law, that's everything. Oh, the law. They couldn't imagine Paul coming along and saying, it was a non-starter. It was never meant to be permanent. And Stephen, said enough that this is why they killed him. He was saying something against the law. And now, of all people to make this statement, the Apostle Paul, who had studied under Gamaliel, and they were trained in the law. If anybody but Paul had said it, you'd say, well, who is he? But Paul said it. And he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. And he's saying the law was never permanent in the first place. It had not come to replace the promise to Abraham. It only came alongside until it was fulfilled, until the seed, that is, Jesus Christ, to whom the promise referred, had come. So, here's another thing. You might have picked up on this. So why did the law come? Well, the answer is, had it not been for the transgressions of the children of Israel, the implication is that the law need not have come at all. It didn't need to come at all. It's only because things got so bad in the Sinai desert, they began to complain, and they were prone to idolatry, and they rose up to play, and all kinds of sexual promiscuity broke in, and hate, and all sorts of things. So God stepped in, gave the law. It didn't produce righteousness, but it did have one effect. It slowed them down. It restrained the people from further sin through fear of punishment. And so they set up, you commit adultery, you're going to die for it. You commit murder, you're going to die for it. And the law had its corresponding punishment. You have to admit, punishment doesn't make people righteous, but keeps us from being worse than we would have been. Here's a great little story. When at Westminster Chapel, there was this hotel in London where I would go and work on my sermons. Nobody knew where it was. Louise knew, and I had one or two very, very close friends. I won't tell you where it was because I may want to go back there one day. It was kind of a boat hole. I went there one Saturday afternoon, and I'd seen it before, but I thought, this is a Saturday afternoon. There was this white paint thing that says, ambassadors only. Ambassadors only. I thought, I don't think that's legal. Who are these ambassadors? They can park there. It's a Saturday afternoon, single yellow line. I think, well, I parked there. I parked there. I came out 3 hours later, and my car wasn't there. Oh dear, somebody's stolen my car. I come into the hotel and I say to the concierge or the maitre d' or whoever, I said, I'm in trouble. My car's not there. They all knew me. They didn't know who I was. They just knew my face. They said, where'd you park it? I said, well, it was right out here. He said, did you park it in the ambassador's parking space? Yeah. No one stole it, sir. They've towed it away. Are you serious? I got on the phone, had to make several phone calls. Yes, they had towed it away. It was 6 miles north in North London. I had to pay 3 fines. Well, the first wasn't a fine. It was 60 pounds for the taxi to take me to get my car. Then 200 pounds to get my car out. And then a month later, a fee from the City of London or City of Westminster for breaking the law. I ended up paying, in order just to park there for 3 hours, around 300 or 400 pounds. Guess what? I never parked there again. Never, ever again. It worked. So, the law restrains through fear of punishment. That's why it came. And if the children of Israel had not been so godless, the law would never come along. But it did come. But here's the thing. It did not produce the righteousness the law required. In a word, the law was temporary from the beginning. It pointed beyond itself by its very content, and all waited for fulfillment. And so Jesus went on to say, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. So it's a way of Jesus saying, I know what I've got to do. He knew his work was cut out for him. It shows what would have to be done. But keep in mind, not only keeping the 10 Commandments, but over 2,000 pieces of Mosaic legislation to be found in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And so the content of the whole law, the statutes, all its rules and regulations, moral, civil, ceremonial, the minutiae of the law, 2,000 pieces of legislation in addition to the 10 Commandments. So the law in all its structure had to be kept. It required the highest possible living, pure living, the highest possible level of pure living in thought, word, deed. It demanded total obedience without the slightest deviation. This is why nobody ever kept it. Circumcision on the 8th day after birth. Well, his parents did that. And then, as he became of age, probably after his bar mitzvah, we don't know exactly when, but he kept Saturday, Sabbath, Shabbat. All the feasts and the holy days, the new moons, the 7th year, Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Feast of Tabernacles, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, dietary restrictions, not cooking a young goat in its mother's milk, things like that. Dress code, not to wear clothing woven to 2 kinds of material. Agricultural restrictions, do not mate different kinds of animals. Do not plant your field with 2 kinds of seed. All those things plus sacrifices of the law, various animals being slaughtered for the shedding of blood. All these things required some kind of fulfillment. I suppose the Jews thought it would go on like that forever. Ask any Orthodox Jew today in Jerusalem, they're still waiting for the Messiah to come. I've tried to get them to see some of them. He has come. They won't have it. But we're here tonight to rejoice that he has come. And all that we do not have to keep. He did it for us. The mission of Jesus would be to close the parenthesis and fulfill the law and the prophets. So keep that in mind. It's easy to forget that. You know what? First of all, when he says they're going to fulfill the law, that's moral, ceremonial, civil, and the prophets. That means whatever Isaiah said, Ezekiel, Daniel, the whole lot. It's an amazing statement. So what was expected of one who would fulfill the law and the prophets? Well, first of all, Isaiah 7 verse 14, he would be born of a virgin. Second, he would be a prophet like Moses. Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 15. I want to read that. I should have had it ready to read. This is a very, very, very wonderful, important verse. It was what was quoted in the book of Acts. It's where Moses said, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own brothers. You must listen to him." And so, Jesus was that prophet. Whoever this would be, he would keep the details of the law, as we saw. He would also be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. We dealt with that last week. He would be of the tribe of Judah and lineage of David. We dealt with that last week. He would be born in Bethlehem, Micah chapter 5, verse 2. He would dwell in Galilee, Isaiah 9, verse 1 and following. Well then, what did Jesus actually do? First of all, he upheld the standard of the law. Some hoped he would abolish it. Nope, no way. He upheld it, and by doing so, maintained the moral standard of righteousness, so that in the new era, which we could call the Christian era, the standard of righteousness continued. Because if we walk in the Spirit, we're going to keep all those things. We'll keep the law without even trying if you're walking in the Spirit. So, he upheld the standard of the law. He was born under the law and submitted to it. So Galatians 4 verse 4, when the fullness of the time was come, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. He did not put himself above the law. He put himself under it. He was not his own man. He didn't decide, I don't think I like this. No, this is why he came. He was not his own man. It says so. John 5:19. The Son can do nothing of himself. What he sees the Father do. It says of Peter, even Christ pleased not himself. So he wasn't enjoying that. He wasn't here on holiday. This wasn't vacation. He had come down to do just this. Born under the law, submitted to it. So he took not on himself the nature of angels, but the seed of Abraham, being bone of our bone and flesh of our flesh. And as I alluded to earlier, his parents kept the law for him, including seeing that he was circumcised the 8th day. And then, when they had performed all these things according to the law, Luke 2:39, they returned into Galilee to their own city, Nazareth. But remember, they had to go to Jerusalem 3 times a year, the feasts. So Jesus was doing that. First, his parents, after a while, Jesus would also do it, because he was going to fulfill it perfectly. So, last but not least, he lived without ever sinning. We do not have a high priest, says the writer of Hebrews, who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. But we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet was without sin. And so, he kept the 10 Commandments. He worshiped only the Father. He never abused his Father's name. He kept the Sabbath from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. He never stole. He never lied. He never coveted. Tempted, yes. Now, one of the great mysteries, and don't ask me to explain this one, how he could be tempted. All I can say is Adam and Eve were tempted, and they had no sinful nature, and yet they were tempted. James says we're tempted not because God tempts us, but when we're drawn away of our own lust. So we are born with a sinful nature, so that temptation is fierce. Jesus didn't have that. He did not have original sin. And so he was perfect in every way. And yet we're told he's tempted. How all that was, I would only say if Adam and Eve could be tempted, so was Jesus. And I would not be surprised at all to learn when we get to heaven that the temptations he faced at every level, at every point, were worse for him than they are for us. Anyway, in a word, Jesus practiced what he preached. He never retaliated when they mocked him. He never complained or murmured. Do you realize if even while on the cross, when he's just got an hour or two left to live, when they were looking up at him and says, "Hey, Son of God, come down from the cross." He saved others, he can't save himself. Jesus didn't say a word. If he had retorted once, the whole thing would have to be called off. But right to the end, he never sinned. How did Jesus fulfill the law? By being our substitute. All he ever did was doing what was required of us. He took our place, ensuring that whatever was required of us, he had already done for us. Never forget this, he was even baptized for us. You see, John's baptism was a baptism of repentance. People knew they were sinners and asked to be baptized. So when Jesus is standing in the queue to be baptized, and John the Baptist recognizes him, he says, "Oh, no, I'm not going to baptize you. You baptize me." Jesus said, "You must do it to fulfill righteousness." Not because Jesus needed it or had repented, but it was for us. For that reason, you don't have to be baptized to go to heaven. The thief on the cross was not baptized. Why should you be baptized then? Well, you want to do everything Jesus did. You follow him in baptism, and it shows you're not ashamed of him. But the fact is, everything required of us, he did. He was baptized for us. He kept the law for us. His obedience was our obedience. He never doubted. Imagine this. He never doubted. Perfect faith. Never doubted. And so all of that was for us. How did he fulfill the law? By suffering for us. The penalty of the law was the death sentence in fulfillment against capital crimes. So, picture this. He's hanging on the cross. At some point in time, between 12 o'clock noon and 3 o'clock on Good Friday, at some point, all our sins were transferred to Jesus as though he had committed those sins. And because the sin had to be given the death sentence, the penalty of the law was the death sentence, it was God who bruised Jesus. It was God who smote him. He was smitten of God and afflicted. It was God who brought about his death. You know, they asked the question, who crucified Jesus? The Jews say, we didn't do it. Well, according to Matthew, they did. Gentiles, no, it wasn't us. It was the Jews. Oh, it was Pilate. We could go down the list. Even the devil was in on it. The devil thought it was his plan. Satan filled Judas Iscariot, and he thought he had pulled off the master plan. And so that when Jesus died, the devils in hell were saying, we did it. But no, God did it. He owned the whole thing. And so by the foreknowledge of God, he was taken. God was at the bottom of it all. So his baptism was our baptism. His keeping the law was for us doing it. His obedience was our obedience. And so while on that cross, Martin Luther once said that legally, Jesus became the world's greatest sinner. Because all of our sins, my word, I just think of my own. That's enough. But yours. Previous generation, all generations, everybody that ever lived. Our sins were transferred to Jesus. And so the penalty of the law was the death sentence. And so our murdering or unforgiveness became his sin. Our adultery or lusting became his sin. He suffered death for us. And so at some point between 12 o'clock noon and 3 o'clock, he who knew no sin, God made him to be sin, who knew no sin, that we might be the righteousness of God in him. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us is turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And this literally happened on this planet Earth, roughly 2,000 miles from London, to a place in Israel, Jerusalem, just outside the city, on Good Friday. And then about the 9th hour, roughly, I would think 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Jesus cried out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani? My God, why have you forsaken me? No man suffered as Jesus did, and we may never know how much. We may not know, we cannot tell what pains he had to bear, but we believe it was for us he hung and suffered there. He fulfilled the requirements of the sacrificial system. He was the seed of the woman, first prophesied in Genesis 3:15. He became our Passover lamb. All the Old Testament sacrifices were shadows. The law is only a shadow of good things, that are coming. Hebrews 10, verse 1. By the way, in my reading today, I don't know if anybody else uses the Robert Murray McCheyne plan, but Hebrews 10 was part of the system. The law is only a shadow of good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifices repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship. So they ought to have known. They ought to have known, but no one thought it through. Jesus then became the fulfillment of all the animals, bulls, goats, lambs, pigeons, the whole lot. Those sacrifices had to be repeated daily and annually. As I said, that fact alone ought to have been sufficient hint to the ancient Israelites, and the Jews, the rabbis, that they were not doing the job very well. Why do you have to keep doing it? It shows that there must be more, that someone must put an end to all the sacrifices. I don't see how any Jew who would believe Scripture could read the Epistle to the Hebrews and remain the same. But on Good Friday, after living a sinless life for 33 years, including 3 years of public ministry, Jesus became God's Lamb. He was the ultimate fulfillment of everything both the law and the prophets anticipated. And once he uttered the words, "It is finished," the veil in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Bodies of the saints rose and walked around Jerusalem. And as you probably have heard somebody preach this, it's a beautiful story. The Greek phrase, past perfect tense of the Greek word teleo, which is tetelestai. We translate it, "it is finished." But tetelestai was a colloquial expression in the ancient marketplace that meant paid in full. They would just stamp on your bill, tetelestai, tetelestai. And that is the word John chose to use to translate, I would have thought, the Aramaic into Greek and now into English. So, here's the wonderful thing. Divine justice was totally satisfied. Jesus therefore met the requirements of the law. When's the last time you read Revelation chapter 5? John says, "I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a scroll with writing on both sides and sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming in a loud voice, 'Who is worthy to break the seals and open the scroll?' But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth could open the scroll or even look inside." John says, "I wept and wept because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or look inside." And one of the elders said to me, "Don't weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed." So when you consider that John said, "I looked under the earth, I looked in heaven, in heaven." There was Enoch in heaven. He walked with God. But he couldn't open the scrolls. Noah was in heaven. He couldn't do it. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they didn't fulfill the law. Moses was faithful, but he didn't fulfill the law. David loved the law, but didn't keep it. The prophets didn't do it. The blood of Jesus did it. He lived a perfect life. His death sealed all that he had done. In a word, mission accomplished. There's more before we finish. Got 7 minutes left. The ongoing fulfillment of the law by us. Jesus died in order that the righteous requirements of the law might be fully met in us, who do not live according to the sinful nature, but according to the Spirit. Having said what he would do, Jesus made another astonishing statement. He said, unless your righteousness surpasses the Pharisees and the teachers, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. Well, no one ever heard anything like that. You think, surpass the righteousness of the Pharisees? I mean, they kept the law perfectly, outwardly. They had fences around the law. They did beyond what the law required. They fasted twice a week. How do you surpass that? You fast 3 times a week? 4 times? How do you outdo the Pharisees? Well, no one ever heard such an utterance. No one believed that ordinary people in Galilee ever came up to the standard set by the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. Surely they had a corner on the market. Surely they were head and shoulders above everybody when it came to righteousness. But Jesus said their righteousness was superficial. They did everything outwardly, because inwardly they were an open graves. The wickedness. You cannot imagine how wickedness. But you see, the Pharisees, they did it all to be seen of men. It wasn't on their radar screen to do it for God. No, they wanted to make sure you saw them. So Jesus gave an interpretation of various commandments that showed how one might surpass the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. And here's how you did it. You could never convince a Pharisee that he had committed murder. But Jesus said, oh, yes, you have. Have you ever hated anybody? Have you ever had a problem with unforgiveness? I tell you, if you're angry with your brother, you'll be subject to judgment. Anyone says to his brother, Raka, that's just a way of putting somebody down, like you say, you stupid twit. You're answerable to the Sanhedrin. If you say, you fool, that's like we'd say, you idiot. You'll be in danger of the fire of hell. You see how you could fulfill the law? As Jesus did, he didn't have those thoughts. Pharisees had those thoughts, but they wouldn't see that they had broken the law. For to them, it was all outward stuff. And so they were sinless. They hadn't committed murder. But if we hold grudges, we have violated the 6th commandment. Jesus said, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. And that's something we can all do. Doing this, according to Paul, listen to this, love fulfills the law. For Paul said that love is the fulfillment of the law. Adultery, it's a matter of the heart. If you commit adultery by lusting, or you cause somebody to lust, according to Jesus, that's adultery. The Pharisees thought they were sinless because they hadn't committed the physical act of adultery. And Jesus showed that lust violates the 10th commandment. And so these are the things. Swearing in God's name. In the Old Testament, swearing was something you're supposed to do. Jesus says, not anymore. You don't even take advantage of God's name. You don't go around to people and say, oh, the Lord told me something. Don't do that, says Jesus. That's violating the 3rd commandment. You're taking the name of the Lord in vain. And so the Pharisees thought they could be without sin as long as they kept their vows. Jesus said that we must not swear by a greater authority every time we open our mouths, but tell the truth all the time. Well, these are examples. Paul says that we walk in the Spirit. We fulfill the law, and you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh when you do that. That means you pray for your enemy. And Jesus said, this is the way you surpass the righteousness of the Pharisees. It's probably an apocryphal story. This man and woman, unhappily married. I hope I haven't told that here. Stop me, Louise. He was a horrible husband. It wasn't me. And he had his rules for his wife, and they were hard to keep. And she hated him. And one day he died. A few years later, she remarried. And she found a man that loved her. He didn't give her those rules. And one day she was cleaning out a drawer or a cabinet, and he came across her husband's old rules. And as she looked down the list, she was keeping every one of them with a new husband without even trying. This is why the standard of righteousness stays the same. In the Old Testament, through fear of punishment, they avoided this outward sin. But in the New Testament, we walk in the Spirit and fulfill the law. So the parenthesis of the law is closed and completed. We're not under the law. We're saved by the righteousness of Christ. And at the same time, we outclass the law. Jesus outclassed the law by his life. We outclass the law by walking in the Spirit.